Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into Joshua chapter 11. This section really ramps up the scale of the conflict described in the book.
Right.
Intense stuff. We want to unpack what the text actually says, look at the narrative flow, and, pull out the main points.
That's right. Chapter 11 is pretty significant. It details this, massive confrontation. It shows a huge coalition forming against Israel, and then describes this really decisive battle and its aftermath.
Okay, let's dive in then. The text kicks off by setting the stage for this.
Right.
Well, enormous showdown. It mentions Jabin, the king of Hazor, hearing about Israel's previous victories. And he reacts, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't sit idly by. He becomes sort of the linchpin here. He starts rallying this huge coalition. The text lists as kings. He sends messages to Macedon, Shimron, Akshaph,
Right.
kings up in the northern mountains, down in the Araba Valley south of Kinnereth, the western foothills, even Naphoth Dor on the coast.
Wow, that's a wide net he's casting, geographically
Yeah.
speaking. And it wasn't just kings joining forces. The text is specific about the different peoples involved, too.
Yeah, it mentions Canaanites from east and west, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites up in the hill country, and also Hivites living below Mount Hermon near Mizpah. It's like a who's who of the inhabitants of the land at that time, all coming together.
And the description of the sheer size of this army, it's really vivid.
It is, isn't it? The text uses that powerful image. All their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore.
As numerous as the sand on the seashore.
Exactly. It's the text's way of saying this force was just immense, almost impossible to count from a human viewpoint.
Right. Just try to picture that. Facing an army described that way.
Huh.
It really puts the scale into perspective, doesn't it? And they all converge on one location.
Mm-hmm. The text says they joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So this specific spot becomes the rallying point for this really formidable opposition.
So, okay, you've got this incredibly diverse, massive army gathered and poised for battle. How does Joshua, leading the Israelites, react to a threat described like that? Does he, panic, call a big meeting?
Well, this is where the narrative introduces that crucial element of divine communication. The text says, "The Lord said to Joshua."
Ah, okay. And I imagine the message isn't just good luck.
Not exactly. It's surprisingly direct. And for Joshua, it must have been incredibly reassuring. The message is simple. Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel, slain.
Wow. Don't be afraid. Victory is guaranteed by tomorrow. That's quite a promise. Powerful divine backing there. But interestingly, the Lord doesn't just promise victory, right? There are also these very specific instructions for after the battle.
Yes, and this is a really fascinating detail. The Lord gives these precise, almost tactical commands for dealing with the enemy's key military assets after they're defeated. Specifically, you are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots.
Hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. That sounds deliberate. Maybe even a bit unusual for handling captured war material. What's the significance of those particular instructions, according to the text?
Well, think about it. Horses and chariots were the advanced military tech of the day, kind of like tanks or armored vehicles. So commanding Israel to hamstring the horses, basically disabling them permanently, and burn the chariots. It's shown as dismantling the enemy's primary tools of power. From the narrative's view, this could be seen as preventing the enemy from using them again, sure, but maybe also preventing Israel from relying on captured tech themselves. It sort of reinforces the idea that their victory comes from the Lord, not just from having the best military gear.
That makes a lot of sense. It's this mix of divine promise, I'll give them to you, and these very practical, maybe even symbolic military orders for afterwards. It really underscores the narrative's focus on both God's power and the human need to follow specific divine instructions, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's not presented as Joshua just sitting back. He and the army have a definite role to play, especially in carrying out these specific post-battle actions.
Okay, so Joshua has the divine assurance. He has the specific instructions. How does the actual battle against this massive coalition play out in the text?
The text describes a very decisive move right after the Lord speaks. It says, "So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them."
Suddenly. That's the key word there, isn't it? Against an army like the sand. Surprise must have been crucial.
Oh, absolutely. You can imagine this huge, perhaps somewhat unwieldy coalition encamped. Maybe they were expecting a more standard, drawn-out approach. A sudden attack would cause chaos, prevent them from properly organizing their numbers or using their chariots effectively.
And the result of this surprise attack.
The text is very clear. The Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. It directly credits the victory to divine intervention. And then it says, they defeated them and pursued them.
And how far did they chase them? Was it just a short pursuit?
No, it sounds like a major rout. The text mentions pursuing them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east. That covers a pretty big area, suggesting the enemy forces were completely scattered.
And the final outcome of that pursuit is described pretty starkly.
Yes, it states plainly, until no survivors were left. The text emphasizes the total defeat of this specific coalition in that battle.
Thinking about that tactically, a surprise attack leading to such complete destruction over a wide area. What advantage does that suddenness give against such a large, encamped army?
Well, like we touched on, a massive force, especially one relying on chariots, needs time and space to deploy properly. A sudden strike denies them that. It creates panic, breaks their command structure. Their numbers can actually become a disadvantage if they're just milling around in confusion. It turns into a rout quickly.
Right, that makes military sense, even within the narrative's divine framework.
Okay.
So the battle's won. The coalition is smashed. The text then shifts focus back to Joshua carrying out those specific commands he received, especially regarding cities and resources.
Exactly. And the narrative makes a point of highlighting his obedience. It says, Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. And it repeats the actions. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. He followed through on neutralizing those key military assets.
And then the focus narrows in on Hazor, which the text reminded us was the leader of this alliance. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. And it explicitly states Hazor's importance. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms.
What was the fate of the people in Hazor itself?
The text uses that very strong, consistent language. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anything that breathed. It mirrors the language used for other populations targeted in the conquest narrative.
And Hazor's fate seems unique compared to other cities mentioned, right? It does. While many royal cities were captured, the text specifically points out he burned up Hazor itself.
So how is that different from how the other royal cities in the coalition were treated?
Well, the text says Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. So, same fate for the kings. And it continues, he totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Again, emphasizing the total destruction of the inhabitants, not sparing anyone that breathed.
But the cities themselves, the buildings.
That's the distinction. The text says, yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. So, destroy the people, kill the rulers, but generally leave the city structures intact, except for Hazor.
And what about the loot? What did the Israelites take from these other cities?
The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities. So the narrative separates the fate of the people, total destruction, from the material goods and animals, which were taken as spoils of war.
You know, something that really jumps out here and throughout this chapter is how often the text explicitly links Joshua's actions back to Moses' commands.
It's absolutely central to how the story is framed. It states it very clearly. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. That chain of command, Lord to Moses, Moses to Joshua, and Joshua's complete obedience, are presented as the driving justification for everything that happens. It frames these really violent events not as random conquest, but as the meticulous execution of a prior divine directive.
That emphasis on obedience really shapes the whole account, presenting Joshua as the perfect instrument carrying out the plan. Then the chapter seems to zoom out again, summarizing the wider campaign beyond just the battle at Merom.
Yes, it gives this broad overview. So Joshua took this entire land, and then it lists regions. The hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel, from Mount Halak to Baal Gad. It covers these major geographical zones, painting a picture of a really comprehensive military effort across the land.
And the kings in these regions, same fate.
Yes, the text confirms. He captured all their kings and struck them down, putting them to death, consistent with the earlier accounts.
Was this whole conquest quick? Like one swift campaign?
The text actually clarifies that and says, Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. So it wasn't just one quick sweep, but a prolonged series of campaigns over a significant period.
Now, were there any exceptions mentioned? Any cities or groups that didn't fight, maybe tried to make peace?
The text highlights one very specific exception. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites who took them all in battle. Gibeon is the sole instance mentioned here of a peaceful arrangement. Every other encounter led to war.
And the text gives a reason, a theological reason, for why the others didn't seek peace. This is quite a striking claim.
It's a really crucial interpretive key in the narrative. It says, "For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses."
Wow. So the lack of peace treaties and the resulting destruction isn't just presented as, political choices leading to war. The text attributes it directly to the Lord, hardening their hearts. What does adding that detail do for the narrative's perspective?
It essentially frames the entire outcome as divinely predetermined. By saying the Lord hardened their hearts so that they would fight and be destroyed according to the command given to Moses, it removes ambiguity about whether destruction was the intended outcome from the text's viewpoint. It portrays it as the unfolding of a divine plan rather than just the consequence of human resistance.
Finally, the chapter brings up one specific group targeted for destruction, the Anakites.
Right. It specifically notes, at that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, listing places like Hebron, Debir, and Anab across Judah and Israel's hill country.
And was this action against them complete?
The text says Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns, but then it adds an important note about survivors. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive.
The Anakites,
Yeah.
they seem significant, singled out like this. From other parts of the story, why might they get this specific mention?
Well, if you remember back to the story of the spies Moses sent out, the Anakites were described as giants, incredibly intimidating figures. They were part of the reason the Israelites were initially afraid to enter the land. So defeating them here, in Joshua 11, serves as a powerful symbol in the narrative. It shows Israel overcoming this particularly fearsome obstacle, fulfilling the conquest.
Right, makes sense. And the chapter then concludes by tying everything together.
Yes, it summarizes. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. The military phase described here leads directly to the allocation of the land.
And that core theme of obedience gets the final word.
It does. The very last sentence reinforces it one more time. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive into Joshua 11, we saw this massive northern coalition form, led by Hazor, described as being like the sand on the seashore. Then came the Lord's promise of victory to Joshua, coupled with those specific commands about hamstringing horses and burning chariots. We looked at the sudden, decisive attack at the waters of Merom, the extensive pursuit, and the text's emphasis on total destruction of the enemy forces. We discussed Joshua's implementation of the commands, the unique burning of Hazor, the destruction of other cities' inhabitants, but preservation of plunder, all linked back to Moses' mandate. We covered the summary of the long war across the land, the notable exception of Gibeon making peace, and the text's striking explanation that the Lord hardened other hearts for destruction. And finally, the specific targeting of the Anakites and the concluding statement about taking the land and distributing it, with that final emphasis on Joshua's complete obedience.
Yeah, it's a chapter packed with intense action and significant theological framing. The scale of the conflict, the divine direction, the specific military actions, the rationale given for the lack of peace, it all contributes to this narrative of divinely commanded conquest being meticulously carried out.
Hopefully, exploring Joshua chapter 11 like this has given you a clearer sense of the events and the perspective presented in this part of the text. So here's something to think about, drawn directly from what we've discussed. The narrative repeatedly, almost insistently, stresses that Joshua left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded through Moses. This included the total destruction of entire populations. What does this portrayal of detailed divine commands and the requirement for absolute complete execution as presented here make you consider about this account?